welcome to this special deep dive. I am so glad you could join us today because we are stepping into some incredibly dense and highly debated territory.
Oh yeah, profoundly polarizing territory today.
It really is. And before we get into the thick of it, just a quick housekeeping note. Please remember to like and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening.
It really helps us out.
It does. It helps the algorithms know you value deep, nuanced conversations, and it ensures you never miss a deep dive.
Exactly.
So today's mission is a comprehensive, unfiltered review of a brand new, highly provocative ebook. We're talking about Conrad Reicher's 2025 release.
Titled Doctors and Engineers, Cultural Enrichment by Mass Replacement Migration.
That's the one. And I want to mention right at the top, if after listening to our analysis today, you want to read this massive text for yourself to see exactly how the arguments are constructed.
Which you might want to do because it is dense.
You can find it and buy it right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. You can also follow the author directly to see his ongoing commentary at Conrad Reicher on Substack. That's the @ Conrad Reicher on Substack.
It is definitely a text that is actively leaving a massive mark on the cultural zeitgeist. I mean, it's generating a sheer wall of discourse online right now.
You really can't miss it.
No, it is impossible to ignore. If you are tracking modern political theory or demographic studies or cultural commentary.
And I want to be entirely transparent with you, our listener, about exactly what this deep dive is going to be and who this book is written for.
Right, we need to set the stage.
We are exploring a very specific, highly charged text. Reicher did not write this to be a neutral academic white paper.
Not at all.
The book is explicitly written to hook a very specific target audience: men's rights activists, the red-pilled manosphere, and readers who feel profoundly alienated by modern Western societal shifts.
That is his core demographic.
The core thesis of Reicher's book is a deep, unflinching exploration of Western institutions. So, medicine, engineering, academia, the state itself.
All foundational pillars.
Yes, and the author claims these pillars were systematically captured by feminists and Marxists, leading to the intentional, deliberate displacement of native populations.
And if you are interested in understanding the history of our institutions before they were allegedly captured by feminists and Marxists.
Or at the very least, if you want to understand the exact argument that this capture has taken place.
Right. This text is essentially the modern blueprint of that worldview.
It really is.
And right here is where I need to firmly step in and establish the absolute ground rules for you, the listener, as we navigate this deep dive together.
Very important.
Because this source material contains intensely politically charged content. It encompasses both right-wing and left-wing cultural touchpoints and touches on the third rails of modern society: race, gender immigration, and institutional trust.
Yeah, the heavy stuff.
So I want to make it explicitly clear, we are never taking a side here. We are not endorsing, validating, or condemning the viewpoints of Conrad Reicher. We are not here to tell you if his sweeping conclusions are morally right or morally wrong.
Our mission as your expert guides is purely analytical.
Purely. We are here to impartially unpack the arguments, dissect the data he presents, and examine the narratives in the text so you can understand the exact anatomy of the author's worldview.
We're looking at the mechanics of the book.
Exactly. How does he build his arguments? What data does he leverage? And how does he specifically tailor his rhetoric to mobilize his target audience?
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the foundational premise of the book. Reicher doesn't ease the reader in with gentle pleasantries.
No, he comes out swinging.
He starts with a sledgehammer in his opening chapters, targeting a word that most of us consider to be an absolute, unquestionable virtue: meritocracy.
It's a bold place to start.
I want to start right there because it feels like a very counterintuitive angle. How does an author who is supposedly advocating for excellence and competence begin by attacking the concept of meritocracy?
He attacks it by claiming the word has been entirely hollowed out and weaponized. Reicher introduces this concept of the Great Delusion.
The Great Delusion.
Yes. He asks his reader to look at the term meritocracy, not as the noble ideal we were taught in grade school.
Where the hardest working and smartest people rise to the top.
Right. Not that. He says look at it as a hijacked concept. And to build this argument, he actually dives into the etymology of the word itself.
Oh, he goes into the history.
He brings up Michael Young, the British sociologist who originally coined the term meritocracy way back in 1958 in a satirical dystopian novel called The Rise of the Meritocracy.
Wait, let me pause you there. The word meritocracy started as a joke, or as a dystopia.
Yes, it did.
Because today, politicians across the entire political spectrum use it as the ultimate goal of a fair society.
Exactly, and that is precisely the historical irony Reicher leverages to hook his reader. Young meant the book as a stark warning.
A warning about what?
The novel depicted a rigid, terrifyingly efficient future society where a new ruling class was built entirely on intelligence testing and relentless effort,
Okay.
creating a society completely devoid of compassion for anyone who couldn't keep up. It was a warning against an inherited cognitive elite.
So it was supposed to be a bad thing.
Right. But Riker argues that today's global technocrats and corporate elites didn't read Young's book as a warning. They read it as a blueprint.
Oh.
Riker claims the modern use of the term is like a rigged game, where the rules are quietly changed by the casino while you, the native citizen, are still playing at the table.
That's a great analogy.
He claims the term has been co-opted by the ruling class to justify what is actually a mass replacement of the native workforce under the guise of seeking the best talent.
So he's taking the prevailing corporate narrative that we live in a globalized world where companies are just scouring the earth for the absolute best and brightest,
Right.
and he's flipping it completely on its head.
What's fascinating here is how Riker completely inverts that standard narrative to appeal to a reader who feels economically left behind.
The guy who played by the rules but still lost.
Precisely. The prevailing story told by major corporations, tech conglomerates, and governments across the West is that nations like the US, Canada, and the UK are suffering from a massive critical talent shortage.
You hear that all the time.
This is the justification used for massive amounts of skilled immigration, particularly through programs like the H-1B visa in the United States, the Express Entry System in Canada, or the EU Blue Card.
Right.
But Riker tells his audience that this talent shortage is a total fabricated illusion.
If it's not a talent shortage, what does he claim it is? Because you look at the tech sector and they are constantly lobbying Congress saying they cannot find enough domestic engineers to fill the roles.
Riker calls it a compliance shortage.
A compliance shortage.
Yes, he argues that domestic engineers, local doctors, and native tech workers are passed over for promotions and hiring not because they lack the requisite skill or education.
Then why?
Because foreign workers on visas are fundamentally different economic assets. According to Riker, visa-dependent workers are cheaper to employ. They are statistically less likely to unionize or demand better working conditions.
And they're tied to their visa.
Crucially, they are legally tied to their employers. If an H-1B worker in the U.S. loses their job, they have a very short window to find another one, or they face deportation.
Right, it's like 60 days or something.
Exactly. Riker argues this creates a workforce that is client obedient and far easier for corporate management to control.
And he doesn't just leave this as abstract theory either. He grounds this argument with some incredibly vivid and frankly emotionally brutal real-world examples in the text.
Very brutal.
I want to look at the story he tells about the Canadian emergency room doctor because this section of the book felt highly engineered to elicit a sense of profound injustice from the reader.
Yes, the rhetorical strategy there is very intentional. He introduces a hypothetical yet composite-based story of a Canadian emergency room doctor.
Yeah, walk us through that.
Riker details his background. Born in rural Saskatchewan, worked incredibly hard, and completed his medical training at McGill University, which is one of the premier medical institutions in Canada.
Right, so he is the quintessential local boy done good. He checks every single box of the traditional meritocratic ideal.
Precisely.
Okay.
But then Riker drops the data point. This doctor applies for 38 different residency positions across hospitals in Ontario and Quebec.
38 positions.
And he is rejected by every single one of them.
Wow.
The reader is primed to ask why. Did he fail his boards? Is he incompetent? Riker claims these rejections had absolutely nothing to do with performance or medical capability.
What does he blame it on?
He points to the systemic structure of the residency matching system. Riker argues that these coveted residency spots were purposefully filled by international medical graduates, or IMGs, who are fast-tracked through government express entry immigration programs.
He paints this picture of the Canadian government running glossy recruitment billboards in Delhi and Manila, actively courting foreign medical graduates, while a domestic McGill-trained doctor is sitting in Saskatchewan, unable to practice medicine in his own country.
It's a very potent juxtaposition.
But does he provide macro data to support this, or is he just relying on isolated emotional anecdotes?
He scales it up immediately. He moves from Canada to the United Kingdom, specifically looking at the National Health Service, the NHS.
Okay.
The book cites statistics claiming that the UK now fills up to 97% of its new general practitioner roles with foreign-trained doctors. predominantly from countries like India, Pakistan, and Nigeria.
97%. That is a staggering figure. How does he explain that within the context of his compliance theory?
He explains it through the lens of pure, ruthless state economics. Riker notes that domestic British medical students currently face strict government caps on the number of medical training slots available at universities.
So they literally cap how many citizens can study medicine.
The state limits how many native British citizens can even become doctors. Riker says the rationale behind closed doors is simple math. It costs the British taxpayer hundreds of thousands of pounds to fund the years of education and training for a doctor in Plymouth or Manchester.
Right.
But if the UK imports a fully trained doctor from Punjab, the Indian taxpayer has already footed the bill for the education.
Oh, I see.
The UK gets the finished product for a fraction of the investment. Riker frames this not as global cooperation, but as the Western state abandoning its duty to educate and uplift its own youth in favor of cheap imported human capital.
That economic ruthlessness really shines through when he pivots from medicine to the tech sector, which is obviously the engine of the modern economy. He goes after the H-1B visa program in the United States with a vengeance.
He does. And he uses data from establishment sources to build his case, which is a key tactic for him.
Right. He doesn't just quote fringe blogs.
Exactly. Riker cites a 2022 Brookings Institution report. Brookings is a mainstream, widely respected think tank.
Very mainstream.
The report states that U.S. universities actually produce roughly 3 times as many computer science graduates as there are H-1B visas issued annually.
Let me make sure I'm following the logic he's presenting to his reader. If U.S. universities are producing 3 times the number of computer science grads as there are visas, the argument that there are simply no Americans available to do the work mathematically falls apart.
That is exactly his point. The math, according to Riker, fundamentally contradicts the corporate narrative of a talent deficit.
Right.
If there is a surplus of domestic graduates, wages should theoretically rise to attract them. Instead, tech companies lobby for more visas to increase the labor pool and keep wages suppressed.
That makes sense from a corporate profit angle.
He points his lens directly at tech titans like Google and highly visible figures like Elon Musk. Musk, the book notes, frequently advocates for massive, unlimited H-1B expansion to bring in top talent while simultaneously orchestrating massive layoffs of American engineers at his companies.
He frames this dynamic with a very specific, chilling phrase: corporate feudalism.
Corporate feudalism, yes.
He's arguing that modern tech companies aren't engaging in free market capitalism. They are building modern fiefdoms.
To support that feudalism claim, he brings in a 2021 MIT study. This study analyzed the behavior of visa-dependent workers in the tech sector.
And what did they find?
They found that H-1B workers are 68% less likely to sue their employers over workplace violations, wage theft, or abusive management practices compared to native-born citizens.
Yeah, that's 68%.
For Riker, this statistic is the smoking gun. It proves to his audience that companies are not importing innovation, they are importing silence. They're importing obedience.
And he humanizes that data with the story of John Carter. This part of the book reads almost like an economic thriller.
It really does.
John Carter is an 18-year veteran at Intel. He's led divisions, he's built major architectural systems, he has a mortgage kids in college. And then, according to Riker's Telling HR, simply walks into his office one random Tuesday and says, "We're going in a different direction. Box up your desk."
And the crucial detail Riker adds is who replaces him. Carter is not replaced by a brilliant new domestic college graduate with fresh ideas.
No.
He is replaced by an H-1B worker who is being paid $30,000 less per year. Riker includes a quote allegedly from the new management justifying the hire, saying the new guy doesn't ask questions, he just works.
Riker uses that specific phrase to basically tell his reader, this is what they think of you. He says that phrase doesn't ask questions, just works, should absolutely terrify any free citizen in a democracy. He equates it to indentured technical labor.
It's a powerful emotional hook for his target audience of men who pride themselves on logic, competence, and building things.
Right.
He's telling them your competence does not matter to the state or the corporation if it comes with the inconvenience of your civil rights.
Exactly.
But Riker knows that to make this a truly comprehensive worldview, he can't just limit his argument to the workplace. He has to show how this alleged system impacts the native citizen outside of office hours.
So he shifts to the housing market.
Right. He shifts his focus to the everyday economic reality, specifically unpacking the housing crisis and wage suppression.
This is where he introduces Maria Ramirez. We go from a tech bro at Intel to a public school teacher in San Francisco. She makes about $80,000 a year, which sounds like a decent salary until you look at the California housing market.
Doesn't go far there.
No. She finds a small, modest studio apartment listed for $3,200 a month. She has pristine credit. She applies for the lease, and she gets flatly rejected.
And Riker asks his reader to focus on why she was rejected. It wasn't because of another local teacher or the local firefighter.
Who was it?
She was outbid by 3 all-cash offers that came in significantly above the asking price. And who made those offers? According to Riker's research in the book, they were foreign investors operating through anonymized shell companies looking to park capital in Western real estate.
So she's playing by the rules of the local economy, but she's suddenly forced to compete against the wealth of the entire globe just to secure shelter in the city where she was born and works.
This is a macroeconomic critique of globalism itself. Riker frames mass migration and the globalization of real estate as twin tools used by the elite administrative class.
To what end?
The strategy, he claims, is to artificially inflate asset prices, specifically housing and land, which the elites own, while simultaneously suppressing the wages of the working class by flooding the labor market.
He points his readers to Toronto as a prime example of this, right?
Yes, the book notes that the average home in Toronto went from around $220,000 in 2001 to over $1.1 million today. Riker argues this astronomical rise is completely decoupled from local wage growth and is driven entirely by mass immigration policies inflating demand.
Does he have academic backing for the wage suppression side of that equation? Because standard liberal economics often argues that immigration actually expands the pie for everyone by creating more consumers.
He directly challenges that liberal economic consensus by citing a major 2019 study by a Swedish economist named Magnus Carlson.
Magnus Carlson, okay.
Carlson looked at high immigration zones in Sweden over a decade. His findings were incredibly controversial. He concluded that native working-class populations in these high immigration zones saw their wage growth lag by up to 15% compared to native populations in homogeneous areas.
Let's break down the logic Riker is extracting from Carlson's data. How does he explain the mechanics of that 15% loss to his reader?
He explains it as a pincer movement on the middle class. The logic Riker presents is that flooding the labor market with millions of new desperate workers creates an artificial surplus of labor.
Right.
If an employer has 100 people begging for a single job, they have absolutely zero incentive to offer raises-proof conditions or provide benefits. They can freeze or even lower wages. That is the bottom jaw of the pincer.
And the top jaw?
The top jaw is the housing market. That same massive influx of people suddenly needs shelter, which creates an artificial explosion in demand for housing, driving rents and home prices through the roof.
So the native citizen is caught in the middle. Their paycheck is stagnating because of foreign labor competition, and their rent is doubling because of foreign housing demand.
Exactly.
And who does Riker say is orchestrating and benefiting from this massive squeeze?
He claims this is the deliberate design of what he calls the new caste system.
The new caste
System, yes. And to illustrate the end goal of this system, Riker points to Dubai. He calls Dubai the ultimate unfiltered naked model of the future that Western elites are trying to build.
How so?
In Dubai, roughly 85% of the total population are expatriates and migrant laborers. They cannot vote. They cannot legally own land in most areas. They have absolutely no permanent civic rights or pathways to citizenship.
They're just workers.
They exist purely as a disposable labor engine.
Correct.
Meanwhile, the global elites live in hyper-luxurious, completely insulated gated communities.
He argues that Western politicians and CEOs look at Dubai and they don't see a human rights violation or a dystopian nightmare. They see utopia. They see a perfectly frictionless economic model without the messy inconveniences of a voting-demanding middle class.
Exactly. In this new caste system Riker outlines for his readers, you have an untethered global elite at the very top who view themselves as citizens of the world. In the middle, you have a massive, imported, entirely dependent labor force.
Then at the bottom.
The native working class and middle class populations are entirely pushed out to the margins. They are economically disenfranchised, unable to afford housing, unable to start families, and unable to compete with the artificially suppressed wages of the imported labor force.
It is an incredibly stark, highly structured, and deeply cynical economic argument. But as comprehensive as part one is, Riker uses it merely as the foundation.
Right, it's just the setup.
Because once he establishes his view that the economic system is deliberately replacing the native worker for the sake of compliance and profit, he then has to answer a psychological question for his reader.
Why aren't people rioting?
Exactly. Why is the native population accepting this displacement? And that leads him to explore the psychological, cultural, and biological mechanisms that he claims are being weaponized to pacify the public.
Which organically brings us to the second major pillar of his worldview, the biological imperative, and what he provocatively terms the war on native men.
Here's where it gets really interesting and where the book takes a hard turn away from standard conservative economics into evolutionary biology and social psychology. He pulls up a very famous, very controversial 2006 study by Robert Putnam, a renowned sociologist at Harvard University.
The inclusion of Putnam is a brilliant rhetorical move by Riker, because Robert Putnam is generally considered to be quite liberal. He is an establishment Ivy League academic.
Right, he's not a fringe guy.
But his 2006 study on diversity and social capital sent shockwaves through the sociology world. Putnam essentially found that high levels of ethnic and cultural diversity actually destroy social trust within communities.
Let's do a quick ELI 5 explain. Like, I'm 5 on Putnam's study for our listeners. How did Putnam actually measure social trust, and what exactly did he find that makes Riker lean on it so heavily?
Putnam looked at dozens of communities across the United States. He measured social trust by looking at tangible behaviors. How often do people volunteer? How frequently do they give to charity? Do they trust the local government? Do they know their neighbors' names?
Okay.
Most importantly, if they lose their wallet on the street, do they believe a stranger will return it?
And what did he find?
What Putnam found to his own reported dismay was that in highly homogeneous communities, trust was very high. But in highly diverse areas, trust completely collapsed. People in diverse neighborhoods didn't just distrust people of other races, they distrusted people of their own race. They essentially hunkered down, withdrew from civic life, and isolated themselves.
And Riker uses this Ivy League data to argue that the prevailing cultural mantra of diversity is our strength is not just a political slogan he disagrees with, but a fundamental biological lie.
Exactly. He claims that forcing diversity onto a population ignores human nature. He leans deeply into a concept from evolutionary biology called Hamilton's rule, or kin selection.
Okay, let me pause you again because we are throwing a lot of dense concepts at the listener. For those of us who haven't taken a graduate level evolutionary biology class recently, what exactly is Hamilton's rule in this context?
Simply put, Hamilton's rule is a mathematical biological formula that explains genetic altruism. It suggests that humans, like all animals, are evolutionary hardwired to prioritize, protect, and sacrifice for those who share their specific genetic and cultural markers.
Meaning you trust people who look and act like you.
The closer the genetic relationship, the higher the biological willingness to cooperate. Riker takes this biological concept and applies it to macro-sociology. He contrasts homogeneous societies against diverse ones to prove his point.
What are his examples?
He points to places like Japan, Poland, and even the micro-societies of the Amish in the United States. These groups exhibit incredibly high social trust, incredibly low crime rates, and strong, unbreakable familial bonds.
Because according to Riker's application of Hamilton's rule, they see themselves and their neighbors. They are biologically and culturally aligned.
Exactly. And he contrasts those high-trust societies against what he sees as the highly fragmented, paranoid, and alienated reality of modern Western cities like London, Chicago, or Malmö in Sweden.
Right.
He claims that by ignoring biology and forcing rapid demographic changes, the state triggers an evolutionary trap where social cohesion fundamentally collapses. People retreat into tribal enclaves and civil society dies.
And he takes this argument about ignoring reality a step further. He claims that this collapse in social trust is actively accelerated by institutions deliberately lowering physical and intellectual standards purely for the sake of achieving equity and forced diversity.
This is where his writing becomes highly visceral. He argues that the ideology of equity demands that outcomes must be equal across all demographics, but since human populations are biologically and culturally different, the only way to achieve equal outcomes is to artificially lower the bar for everyone. He goes into intense, agonizing detail about emergency services, where lowering the bar has literal life and death consequences.
He cites a very specific 2015 lawsuit involving the New York City Fire Department. What exactly is he claiming happened there?
He details a federal push where the NYFD was pressured to diversify its ranks. According to Riker's analysis of the lawsuit, the physical standards tasks like carrying a heavy dummy down a flight of stairs or breaching a door were allegedly altered or lowered because female and minority recruits were failing at higher rates than white male recruits.
Lowered the physical standards?
Yes, and Riker uses this to ask his audience a terrifying question. When you are trapped on the 4th floor of a burning building, do you want a firefighter who passed the hardest possible physical test or a firefighter who passed a lowered standard designed to appease a diversity quota.
He points to an international example too, right? The
Yeah.
Brussels fire.
Yes, he recounts a horrific incident in Brussels. According to the text, a squad of firefighters was deployed to a major blaze. The commander shouted evacuation orders over the radio in Dutch.
Okay.
However, to meet diversity integration quotas, the city had hired migrant firefighters who did not fully comprehend the local language. Riker claims the migrant firefighter misheard or misunderstood the Dutch command, leading to a deadly delay in the evacuation protocol.
And he extends this from physical brawn to intellectual competence. He points to the National Oil Company of Venezuela, PDVSA, under the regime of Hugo Chavez.
This is his ultimate warning of civilizational collapse. Before Chavez, PDVSA was run by highly trained, deeply experienced native engineers who understood complex fluid dynamics and geological pressure systems.
Real meritocracy.
Right. Chavez, driven by Marxist equity principles, fired these meritocratic engineers and replaced them with politically loyal party members and diverse working-class representatives who possessed zero technical expertise.
And what happened?
The result was the total catastrophic collapse of Venezuela's oil production, leading to nationwide starvation and the ruin of the country's economy.
Riker uses all these examples to drive home a singular, brutal thesis statement. You cannot legislate away the laws of physics or biology. Gravity doesn't care about your pronouns.
Right.
When a building is on fire or a bridge is under load, nature doesn't care about diversity quotas. As Riker dramatically writes to close out that chapter, nature always bats last.
From that foundational argument about the denial of biology, Riker transitions into what is arguably the emotional core of the book for his specific red-pilled manosphere audience.
The feminization stuff.
Yes, he introduces the concept of the feminization of the state, and he asserts that the modern bureaucratic state has been completely and intentionally weaponized against traditional native masculinity.
How does he define traditional native masculinity, and why does he think the state is at war with it?
Riker views the state no longer as a neutral arbiter of laws, which is the classical liberal view, but as a hyper-ideological, maternalistic entity.
Maternalistic.
He claims this feminized state actively pathologizes the exact evolutionary traits that built Western civilization in the first place. Traits like competitiveness, assertiveness, directness, physical strength, and risk-taking.
The examples he uses to illustrate this pathologizing are incredibly specific, and they are designed to make his male readers feel an acute sense of persecution. He tells the story of a father in Sweden. What happened there?
He details an anecdote where a Swedish father was called into a parent-teacher meeting because his young son was acting out roughhousing and crying. The father, trying to instill stoicism, simply told his son to be a man and stop crying.
And what did the school do?
According to Riker, the school reported this to social services, and the state actually fined the father 10,000 kronor for inflicting emotional abuse by enforcing rigid gender stereotypes.
So the state is literally criminalizing traditional fatherhood.
Yeah, exactly. But the rhetorical twist Riker adds is the double standard. He points out that while the native Swedish father is fined and publicly shamed for a mild assertion of traditional masculinity, immigrant fathers from deeply patriarchal fundamentalist cultures are simultaneously praised by the state and the media.
Praised for what?
For maintaining their beautiful tribal loyalty and cultural heritage, even when that heritage is infinitely more oppressive than telling a boy to toughen up.
He moves from Sweden to a classroom in Finland to show how early this psychological conditioning starts. He shares an anecdote about a young Finnish boy.
Right, the soldier story.
The teacher asks the class what they want to be when they grow up. The boy raises his hand and proudly says he wants to be a soldier to defend his country. And the teacher's response is basically an intervention.
Yep.
She smiles condescendingly and tells him in front of the whole class, "Wouldn't you rather be a caregiver, a nurse? The world is peaceful now. We need more nurturing, gentle men, not violent ones."
Riker uses these specific classroom-level examples to argue that native boys are undergoing systemic psychological disarmament from the moment they enter preschool. They are taught that their natural biological instincts are inherently toxic.
That's a heavy burden to put on a kid.
And Riker connects this psychological disarmament to devastating real-world data. He points to the rising tragic suicide rates among native men in countries like Finland, long touted as a progressive utopia.
Yeah, he cites a statistic that the suicide rate for Finnish men aged 25 to 34 rose an astonishing 40% between the years 2000 and 2020. That is an epidemic of despair. How does he tie that back to his thesis?
Riker attributes this death toll directly to purpose deprivation. He argues that for thousands of years, men derived their psychological stability from their roles as protectors, builders, and providers.
Right.
The feminized state, he argues, has stripped Native men of these historical roles, outsourced the building and protecting to others, and labeled their natural instincts as toxic masculinity.
But they don't do that to everyone.
No, the devastating irony Riker highlights is that the state simultaneously imports millions of men from foreign cultures that highly value male dominance, aggression, and tribal loyalty. He tells his audience the state is demanding that you become a pacifist while importing an army. It creates an incredibly unequal, highly dangerous playing field for the Native man.
And that unequal playing field leads directly into his most controversial and frankly most provocative sociological claim, the mating market dynamics. This is where he speaks directly to the core anxieties of the manosphere. Riker dives incredibly deep into female hypergamy.
Yes, and we need to understand how he frames this biologically. He relies on evolutionary psychology to claim that women are biologically fundamentally wired by millions of years of evolution to seek out high-status, dominant, high-testosterone traits in a mate to ensure the survival of their offspring.
He states this as a hard fact.
He states this not as a cultural preference, but as an inescapable biological imperative.
But according to Riker, the feminized state and modern culture have completely skewed this natural market.
Precisely. If we connect this to the bigger picture Riker is painting, he argues that the state has orchestrated a massive demographic mating collapse for the Native man.
A mating collapse.
By flooding Western nations with foreign men from patriarchal cultures, men who, as Riker describes them, do not apologize for their masculinity, who carry themselves with assertiveness, and who demand respect.
While simultaneously forcing Native men to undergo decades of education, telling them to be emotionally submissive, overly agreeable, and endlessly apologetic for their privilege.
The state has rendered the Native man biologically unattractive to the Native woman.
He describes this dynamic with a very clinical, terrifying phrase for his audience: evolutionary recalibration. He's basically saying the market is adjusting and you, the Native man, are being priced out. Does he have data for this, or is this just pure grievance?
He cites modern dating metrics, specifically pointing to a large-scale YouGov survey conducted in the UK. According to his interpretation of the data, a vast majority of British women on dating apps exhibit a marked preference for foreign or mixed-race men over native British men, even when income, education, and physical symmetry are identical.
Wow.
He tells anecdotes of native software developers, guys earning huge six-figure salaries, the supposed winners of the meritocracy being routinely rejected on dates for being too nice, too agreeable, or lacking edge.
Well, according to Riker, their foreign colleagues are praised by these same women as exotic, dominant, and exciting, precisely because they don't conform to Western feminist behavioral standards. They expect respect and act with traditional authority.
And for Riker and his readers, this is the ultimate existential betrayal. He concludes this section by telling his audience that Native men are not just being erased from the corporate boardroom or pushed out of the construction site. They're being systematically, deliberately erased from the genetic future of their own nations.
It's an argument designed to bypass logic and strike directly at the most primal evolutionary fears of his male readership.
Very much so.
It's an incredibly bleak, almost suffocating picture he paints. It's designed to make the reader feel completely cornered. But he doesn't stop at the biological or economic level. He anticipates the reader's next question. If this is all happening and it's so obviously detrimental, how is it allowed to continue? Why isn't the public voting to stop it?
That's the million-dollar question.
And that brings us to his concept of institutional collusion. We move into part 3, the woke blob media borders and the eradication of truth.
Riker claims that none of this massive demographic and economic displacement could happen in a functioning democracy without the total coordinated institutional collusion of what he terms the woke blob.
I've heard variations of that term before. How exactly does Riker define the woke blob in the context of this book?
He defines it as an unholy, completely symbiotic trinity composed of the corporate media academia and the permanent state bureaucracy.
Those three.
He argues that these three pillars are no longer separate entities holding each other accountable, but a single ideological organism with a shared goal. And their primary, most effective weapon against the native citizenry, the suppression of data and the eradication of objective truth.
He argues that the administrative state uses the guise of compassion and anti-racism as a moral cover for what is actually administrative sabotage against his own citizens. And he brings receipts when it comes to the manipulation of crime statistics. The claims he makes here are staggering.
He points specifically to a very controversial 2017 decision made by Sweden's National Police Board. In 2017, the Swedish police officially decided to delete the ethnicity and national origin fields from their national crime database.
Delete them completely.
Riker dissects the rationale given by the police, which was to prevent prejudice and avoid stigmatizing minority groups, and completely shreds it. He argues this is a deliberate, calculated move to blind the public to hide the undeniable statistical reality of surging migrant gang violence, bombings, and sexual assaults that were tearing Swedish society apart.
So he's saying the state didn't fix the crime problem, they just made it illegal to measure it.
Exactly. And he follows that up with a massive scandal from Germany. He points to a 2024 investigative report by Der Spiegel, a highly credible German publication.
Right, Der Spiegel is huge.
The report alleged that Germany's top federal police and intelligence agencies, the BKSI and the BFE, were actively suppressing and altering migrant crime statistics. And the alleged reason, specifically to avoid fueling right-wing narratives and to protect the legacy of Angela Merkel's open-door immigration policies.
Riker's takeaway for the reader is profound here. He says that when the state begins lying about basic empirical realities like crime and physical safety in order to protect an ideological narrative, civilization is already in a state of active collapse.
The social contract is broken.
And he applies this exact same lens to the border crisis in the United States.
He looks at the sheer scale of the border numbers. He cites the 2.5 million apprehensions by U.S. Customs and Border Protection in a single year, 2023. He analyzes the deliberate political dismantling of the Remain in Mexico policy, which previously forced asylum seekers to wait outside the U.S. while their claims were processed.
And he goes after the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, which he sees as the enforcement arm of the woke blob. He brings up groups like Race, pointing out that they are heavily funded by liberal Silicon Valley billionaires.
Right.
He notes how these NGOs use their massive war chest to actively sue the federal government to block deportations, basically tying up the legal system so that no one can ever be removed.
Riker uses all this to make a fundamental paradigm shift for his reader. His absolute conviction is that the border system isn't broken. When politicians go on TV and say the system is broken, Riker claims they are lying. It's not a failure of competence, and it's not a lack of resources.
What is it then?
He claims the system is succeeding perfectly at its actual unspoken goal. Demographic replacement. The chaos is the feature, not the bug.
But to maintain a system that is so obviously damaging to the local population, the woke blob needs to control how people think about it. And that leads to Riker's critique of linguistic sabotage and media complicity. He argues the media acts as the propaganda wing of the state.
He traces how the media subtly and methodically changes the rules of language to alter public perception over time. He notes how major institutions like the Associated Press Style Guide and the BBC officially changed the term illegal immigrant to undocumented person.
That shift happened a few years ago, yeah.
To Riker, this is a brilliant piece of psychological warfare. Undocumented sounds like a mere clerical error. It sounds like someone just forgot their paperwork at the DMV. It completely erases the criminality, violation of sovereignty, and the physical act of crossing the border.
It softens the reality.
He argues that in the language of the blob, words like diversity are actually used as synonyms for erasure, and the phrase cultural enrichment actually translates to demographic substitution.
He argues the media is completely complicit in hiding the victims of this substitution. The book points out how the corporate media will endlessly run glowing, beautifully shot features on immigrant entrepreneurs. And look, that is the classic, heartwarming American dream narrative.
Sure it is.
But Riker says they run those stories to completely black out and ignore the agonizing stories of native displacement.
And to illustrate this, he tells the heartbreaking story of Joe Kowalski. Joe is a third-generation mechanic in Detroit. He's the bedrock of his working-class community. But Joe had to shutter his family business and declare bankruptcy.
Why?
Because 3 new Somali-owned garages opened up within a 6-block radius of his shop. And Riker points out the crucial detail. Every single one of those new garages was heavily subsidized and launched with a $75,000 federal refugee small business grant.
So Joe is paying taxes to a government that then gives his tax dollars to foreign nationals to open businesses directly competing with him, allowing them to undercut his prices until he goes bankrupt.
Exactly. And the kicker to the story is that Joe, desperate to save his grandfather's shop, actually applied for the exact same federal small business grant. And he was flatly denied because, as a native-born citizen, he didn't qualify for the refugee enrichment funds.
That is brutal.
Riker tells his audience the New York Times will never, ever tell Joe's story because Joe doesn't fit the narrative of the woke blob. Joe is considered collateral damage in the quest for diversity.
So if the media won't tell the truth and the government is actively suppressing data, where can a citizen turn? Historically, people turn to religion or education for truth. What does this all mean for our cultural institutions?
Well, Riker argues they've been just as captured.
He initiates a blistering critique of what he calls the Church of Woke. He looks at traditional religious institutions, pointing specifically to massive suburban megachurches and even aiming his sights at the Vatican and Pope Francis.
Yeah, he goes right to the top.
Yeah. He criticizes them heavily for abandoning traditional localized scripture in favor of pushing a globalist open borders theology. Let's expand on that. How does he see the church being captured?
He argues that many modern churches have essentially traded salvation for government funding. He claims they have become taxpayer-funded resettlement NGOs, receiving massive federal grants to facilitate migrant housing.
Doing the government's work.
He argues they care more about social engineering diversity quotas and preaching intersectionality than they do about the spiritual salvation of their local flocks.
Let me jump in there just to clarify terms for the listener. When Riker criticizes them for pushing intersectionality, what does he mean in this context?
Intersectionality is an academic framework that categorizes people based on their overlapping identities of oppression, race, gender, sexual orientation, etc. Riker argues that the church has adopted this Marxist hierarchy, meaning they view a native white working class parishioner as an oppressor who needs to atone while viewing a newly arrived migrant as inherently virtuous due to their oppressed status. He claims this completely perverts the Christian doctrine of equal grace.
And if the church is compromised, he argues academia is even worse. This leads to what I found to be his most fascinating philosophical argument in the entire book, the death of the trivium.
This is a profound point. The trivium is the foundation of classical Western education, dating back to the Middle Ages. It consists of three pillars: grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Break those down for us.
Grammar is learning the foundational rules and facts of reality. Logic is the ability to connect those facts to find objective truth. And rhetoric is the ability to persuade others of that truth. Riker argues that the modern university system has actively, intentionally assassinated the trivium.
He argues they have completely inverted it. They prioritize emotional rhetoric first. They actively destroy grammar by claiming definitions of words like man or woman are subjective, and they view logic as an actual tool of oppression. What are the examples he gives of this ideological capture?
He provides alarming, documented examples from the Ivy League. He cites an instance at Columbia University where a tenured professor was formally reprimanded by the administration for assigning Plato's Republic.
Plato.
The reason. A student complained that the classical Greek ideals of objective truth and virtue promoted white supremacy and made them feel unsafe.
He also mentions a debate at the University of Michigan.
Yes, a planned debate titled, "Is Meritocracy Racist?" Riker notes that the debate had to be canceled because student activists and faculty moderators declared that the very act of demanding empirical evidence statistics and formal logic was relying on colonial tools of oppression.
They called logic colonial.
He points to Harvard University requiring mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion loyalty oaths for any new faculty member to even be considered for a job. For Riker, this proves that the Socratic method of rigorous, uncomfortable debate has been entirely replaced by safe space pedagogy. It's an environment where subjective feelings fundamentally trump objective facts, and reality itself is penalized if it causes emotional discomfort to a protected class.
He illustrates this academic death with the story of a graduate student at Yale. The student was pursuing his degree in political science. He wrote a thesis using standard peer-reviewed economic models, basic supply and demand logic to argue that mass migration negatively impacts the housing availability and wage growth of native citizens.
And what happened to his thesis?
He was denied his degree, but Riker emphasizes why he was denied. The Academic Review Board didn't say his mathematical models were wrong. They didn't say his data was flawed. They denied him because they stated his rhetoric was harmful to marginalized communities.
And that is Riker's concluding thought on institutions. When empirical truth is officially categorized by universities as harm, the academy is dead. The pursuit of knowledge has been replaced by the enforcement of dogma.
At this point in the book, the reader is likely feeling completely overwhelmed, surrounded on all sides by institutional capture. But, and this is where the book makes its major structural pivot, Riker doesn't end on a note of nihilism or despair. He doesn't want his readers to just be angry and depressed. He moves into part 4, the Red Pill Awakening and the Path to Reclamation.
This is where Riker stops diagnosing the problem and directly addresses his manosphere audience with a tactical manual. He shifts from broad critique to highly specific strategy. He outlines what he views as a burgeoning counter-revolution, one that is ironically born out of the very censorship the woke blob utilizes. He introduces a concept he calls the censorship resistance feedback loop.
This is his argument that banning controversial figures doesn't silence them at all. It acts as a massive accelerant. It multiplies their influence exponentially. He uses figures like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson as his prime examples.
Exactly. When those figures were purged from mainstream corporate control platforms like YouTube, Twitter, or mainstream publishing houses, the woke blob thought they had achieved victory. But Riker points out that the ideas didn't disappear.
Of course not.
Millions of young men perceiving the censorship as proof that these figures were speaking dangerous truths simply adapted. They downloaded VPNs, they migrated to unmoderated alternative platforms like Rumble, Telegram, and X, and they started sharing forbidden content through vast decentralized shadow libraries like Library Genesis.
I want to focus on that point about shadow libraries because Riker notes a fascinating trend. These young men aren't just downloading political manifestos or modern podcast transcripts. He points out that shadow libraries are seeing millions of downloads for texts written thousands of years ago.
This raises an incredibly important question about the nature of this awakening. Riker notes that these young men abandoned by modern academia are teaching themselves. They are downloading the works of classical philosophers like Arthur Schopenhauer, Friedrich Nietzsche, and the Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius.
They're reading the classics.
They are actively seeking out the foundational texts of Western civilization because they realize the corporate media machine has starved them of meaning. They are abandoning the mainstream entirely to forge their own intellectual republic.
So Riker's telling his readers, you are not victims of the system. You are the vanguard of a new parallel society. But he doesn't just want them reading philosophy in the dark. He demands action. He advocates for the physical active construction of parallel institutions. Since the public schools and the Ivy League are, in his view, completely captured by Marxist ideology and beyond saving, he advises men to enact a total walkaway.
And he lists specific concrete actions that are already happening. He talks about the movement of fathers deliberately pulling their children, especially their sons, out of the public school system. He argues that public schools are places where children are taught to hate their own history, where they are introduced to pronoun wheels in kindergarten and subjected to endless gender theory. To replace this, Riker highlights the explosive growth of classical academies.
He names specific networks, places like the Socratic Academy in Ohio, the Leibniz Academy in Idaho, and the massive Great Hearts Charter Network across the Sun Belt. These aren't fringe setups. Great Hearts has tens of thousands of students on wait lists.
And the curriculum is the key. Riker explains that these classical academies flatly refuse all DEI mandates. They don't have safe spaces. Instead, they resurrect the trivia.
They bring it back.
They teach young boys how to read Homer's Iliad to understand heroism. They teach Latin to instill grammatical discipline. They teach formal logic so students can dismantle fallacious arguments. Riker emphasizes that the parents funding and building these schools aren't rich liberal elites. They are working-class men, plumbers, mechanics, and local business owners who are pooling their resources to rescue their children from state indoctrination.
Furthermore, Riker focuses heavily on the restoration of physical male brotherhoods to combat the crushing psychological toll of modern alienation. He profiles a specific group to illustrate this, the Iron Fellowship in Austin, Texas.
The Iron Fellowship is a fascinating case study in Riker's worldview. This is a rapidly growing group of men who deliberately reject the comfort of modern life. They meet at 5:30 in the morning in the Texas heat. They strap on 50-pound rucksacks and walk 5 miles together in silence. Afterward, they study Stoic philosophy and hold each other brutally accountable for their personal and professional failures.
Riker frames this deliberate pursuit of physical hardship and strict male exclusivity as the ultimate antidote to what he calls the feminist therapy industrial complex.
Yes, he argues that the modern therapeutic state tells men that the solution to their depression is emotional vulnerability, crying, and endlessly talking about their feelings. Riker wholly rejects this. He argues that men don't need emotional vulnerability to heal. They need duty. They need physical strength, a sense of shared hardship, and the unbreakable bonds of an exclusive tribe. He claims that only by rebuilding these primal fraternities can men develop the psychological armor needed to withstand the woke blob.
It's all about rejecting the rotting system and building a new hardened one from the ground up. But Riker knows that small academies and men's groups in Texas might feel like a drop in the ocean. The reader needs proof that this resistance can scale to the national level. And for his ultimate macro-level model of reclamation, Riker points to one specific sovereign nation, Poland.
He holds Poland up as the shining beacon of hope. The ultimate success story of a native population successfully resisting the woke blob and maintaining its national soul. And historically, this makes sense. Poland is a nation that has survived centuries of attempts by outside empires, from the Prussians to the Soviets, to erase its culture.
How does Riker analyze Poland's modern resistance? What exactly did they do right, in his view?
First and foremost, he praises the Polish political model for its absolute uncompromising rejection of the European Union's migration quotas. When the administrative bureaucrats in Brussels tried to pressure and blackmail Poland into accepting massive unvetted migrant flows from the Middle East and North Africa under the guise of shared European responsibility, Poland simply said no.
They shut the door.
They built physical walls, they deployed their military, and they secured their borders. They prioritized the physical safety of their native citizens over the moral approval of the global elite.
But Riker points out that their resistance wasn't just physical defense, it was internal economic and cultural strategy. He highlights how Poland actively rebuilt its technical workforce.
Yes, instead of claiming a talent shortage and importing cheap labor like the UK or Canada, Poland invested heavily in its native sons. Riker details how the Polish government created programs funding zero-interest loans for local native-owned businesses. Crucially, these loans came with zero strings, attached no requirements for ESG compliance.
Just to clarify, ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance Criteria, which is essentially a corporate scorecard for diversity and climate policies that many Western banks now require for funding.
Exactly. Poland rejected the ESG scorecard. They allowed local bakers, builders, and tech firms to hire local Polish apprentices based purely on merit and cultural fit, creating a booming, self-sustaining middle class.
And culturally, Riker points to the role of the Polish Catholic Church. Unlike the Western megachurches he criticized earlier, he claims the Polish Church acted as a shield for national identity. He highlights a massive parallel education network launched within the country called Domowa Szkoła, or homeschool.
By 2024, the book claims over 40,000 students were enrolled in this parallel system. It operates entirely outside the purview of the progressive EU educational mandates. These students are learning classical Latin, unvarnished Polish history, and classical logic, entirely bypassing the curricula, pushing gender theory or post-nationalism. For Riker, Poland is the living, breathing proof that a nation does not have to die. A nation can survive and even thrive if it stubbornly refuses to outsource its labor, its borders, and its soul.
Which brings us to Riker's final resounding, deeply militant message to his target audience. He doesn't end with a plea for political compromise. He tells the men reading his book, do not wait for a political savior. Do not submit to the psychological guilt trips of the media. Do not fear the censorship of the state. He urges them to act right now, to build their own uncancelable businesses, to fund classical schools to marry and father children, and to fiercely, unapologetically defend the legacy of Western civilization using the tools of logic, physical strength, and unyielding truth. It is a highly mobilizing call to action designed to completely awaken and radicalize the red-pilled reader into action.
I have to say, looking back at the journey we've just taken, it is truly an ultra-long, incredibly dense and incisive scope of material we've unpacked today.
We've gone from the macroeconomics of the H-1B visa and the concept of corporate feudalism to the evolutionary psychology of modern dating apps, through the destruction of the classical trivium in academia, all the way to the Stoic brotherhoods of Texas and the sovereign resistance of Poland. I want to sincerely thank you, the listener, for sticking with us through such an intense, deep, and unsparing dive into a highly controversial, highly detailed worldview. It is a massive amount of ideological architecture to process.
It certainly is a monumental amount of theory to synthesize. And before we officially wrap up, I want to leave you with a final overarching provocative thought to mull over on your own as you digest this deep dive.
What's that?
Throughout this massive text, Riker frames the defining conflict of the 21st century, not as a traditional kinetic war between competing nations like America versus China, but as a brutal internal civil war. A war between a globalized, highly mobile administrative elite who view borders as economic obstacles, and localized native working-class populations who view borders as the last line of defense for their culture and livelihood. If we assume for a moment that this hypothesis holds true, that the primary fracture in modern society is indeed between the global woke blob and the local-rooted citizen, how will the very definition of citizenship fundamentally change in the next 50 years? Will we see the complete irreversible dissolution of national borders as we know them, giving way to a globalized new caste system of corporate feudalism managed by technocrats? Or will the pressure of displacement cause a massive violent backlash resulting in a return to highly fortified, fiercely homogenous city-states where citizenship is determined entirely by blood and shared culture. It is a stark, terrifying question that builds directly on Riker's darkest fears and most ardent predictions, and is a question that history inevitably will have to answer.
That is a profoundly heavy, fascinating question to end on. A huge thank you once again to you, our listener, for joining us as we navigated the complex architecture of this text. Please remember to take a second to like and subscribe to the show so you can catch our next deep dive into the ideas shaping our world. As a final reminder, today's extensive deep dive analyzed Conrad Riker's highly provocative 2025 ebook, Doctors and Engineers, Cultural Enrichment by Mass Replacement Migration. If you want to explore the source material for yourself to see exactly how these arguments read on the page, you can find it and purchase it right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. And be sure to follow the author for his latest updates at Conrad Riker on Substack. Thank you so much for listening. Stay curious, and we'll see you next time. Farewell.